like, the older that the kiddos get, the gaps continue to widen. And as much as I hate that kind of terminology, it's very true, right? The ante is upped every year in school. There's more curriculum, there's more hurdles to jump through. Just with my own daughter, moving into second grade, it's like kindergarten is kind of exploring and getting to know things better. And then just all of a sudden in first grade, she's, starting to read and working on math. And it's like, whoa, this kind of evolved overnight. And now different, concerns and strengths and areas of growth are kind of popping up. So a lot of these students, especially, if you're fostering a child that might have moved schools or districts or even kind of just had a little bit of a gap, even though something was going on, and they might have missed a certain kind of section all entirely. It's like you see that come up as things kind of grow in continuity of the school year and different grade levels. We also see, and I'll get into it in a minute, but different behavioral concerns, right? Is behavior is usually communication, and when we're looking at how, why this behavior, yeah, sometimes it changes and it seems like a moving target too over the grade level years. So yeah, I just want to kind of really affirm that you're not alone in this. Um, these parents on Instagram saying that, everything's perfect, and we have the perfect school and our child has straight A's. It's oftentimes not reality for many of us, and that's okay. So before we begin, if you want to go into your packet, if you're a kind of kinesthetic learner like I am, I like kind of writing things down. It's a skill, but it also kind of re-engages you. But go ahead and kind of raise your hand, or you could kind of check on your own box that you've attended an IEP or an individual education plan meeting. I don't have my little uh, face windows up, but cool. Go ahead and put down your hands. If you've attended a Section 504 plan meeting, go ahead and raise your hand too. Some of you might have raised your hand for both because that's part of kind of the continuum oftentimes is that we move from a 504 to an IEP. Okay. And then raise your hand if you've heard terms like FAPE or IDEA or MTSS, all of these acronyms, Free Appropriate Public Ed, um, Individuals with Disability Education Act, and then multiple tiered systems of support. Great. And then this is kind of a tough one, but you've left a school meeting more confused than when you arrived. I know I've been there before as an advocate and as a parent. Absolutely. All right. So here's a good kind of news piece is, your child, or you're getting to know your child better. Um, you don't need to be an expert. You don't need to, be an educator. Some of the families that I support, I would say actually many of the families I support, work in education themselves. And look at that. They've hired an advocate, a representation to better help them better understand kind of what supports even exist. And it's like, well, you work out of school. That doesn't mean that you have this full idea or comprehension of the full continuum of support in that school or district. Um, Also, really understanding how these schools make these decisions, right? We might know our child, we might know exactly what they need, but being able to ask what it is that we need and the why behind that, oftentimes dictates whether or not the school's going to move or the district's going to move on said request. So it's being able to funnel those things appropriately. And then obviously what questions to ask, right? I think there's an art behind, getting the information you need to get. Well, you're going to have to ask that question to be able to better understand what it is you're looking for. Um, and then I think this is the big one as a parent, there's a humbling thing too, is when to ask for help. Sometimes, we are an expert in kind of the X's and O's of academics. Okay, I could support or tutor my child here. But then when it comes to, speech, articulation, social pragmatics, it's like, oh my gosh, I that's not my area of forte. I might need another set of eyes to look at that report. Not that we don't trust necessarily the school or the district, although sometimes we don't. But ultimately, it's being able to better collaborate at that meeting. I think one of the biggest, misconceptions on the school and school district side of things is that these meetings are meant to be like a monologue where it's like, here, we're going to share our report and recommendations here. Parent, you're going to listen. You're going to drink from a fire hose. We're going to share the report with you, after the meeting or during or a day prior. Great. That's not, oftentimes helpful. And then there's almost this kind of sometimes this kind of annoyed feeling by the school or the district where it's like, oh my gosh, they have questions. Like, yeah, we have questions. We're trying to better understand what these reports mean for, either the trajectory of our child or, what services they qualify. And I think I qualify for, but ultimately, that is not what it is. And this is where a lot of districts get in trouble and due process and why attorneys and advocates kind of come on board is because there's not that participation on the parent side. They leave more confused. They have these questions that weren't answered, and ultimately they were kind of put in this position where it's like, well, I don't really understand. I guess I just have to kind of trust the school to author whatever services or goals or not, based on the recommendations that we have from this report. And ultimately, in many states, that's what often leads to like an IEE or an independent educational evaluation. And basically, what that comes about when that comes about is when we have a report that was written or conducted. Let's say that there was a full psychoeducational evaluation report conducted. We get all those results. We look at the results. It's a oftentimes a 40, 50 page document, depending on how old the child is. And then ultimately, based on the report, they recommend something that, might not be appropriate, might not be FAPE based off of the recommendation report. And that's oftentimes where there will be a dispute and say, hey, I disagree with the recommendations based off this report. And we're going to lobby for an independent educational evaluation or an outside eval, from a neutral party, usually at the district or the state's expense. And they conduct their own independent assessment. And then they re-meet, and they talk about, what supports they think that sometimes the support and recommendation doesn't change, but oftentimes it does, right? And that's not to throw districts or schools under the bus. There's a line item in the budget for just that, just the IEs itself. But ultimately, it's a lever that many of these states have put into place to try to keep districts out of due process and out of having to pay more money in the long term. Is ultimately it's in the incentive to get these things right. So it's important to be able to get the appropriate set of eyes on these documents so that you could better understand, show up to these meetings, collaborate, and be like, hey, I see a need here for, social pragmatics or, my child not being able to communicate with others. What can we do about that where it might have been kind of glazed over and just looked at as, oh, it's just an articulation issue. We're going to work on, articulating these sounds better when that might not even be the center area of concern based off of the results that they provided. So just want to share a little bit about the pathway that we're looking at typically. You enroll your kiddo at the school district. They're going to be in a general education setting, right? And that's with typically developing peers, and no further intervention supports. It's what many of us are used to as kids ourselves, right? Is yeah, it's the general education class. It's taught one way typically. It's usually one teacher depending on the grade level. But then a little further up the continuum would be like general education with support. It's like maybe there's some reading intervention, there's some math intervention. Maybe there's like small groups within the class, right? To be able to say, okay, you're going to go to your little breakout area with Miss Becky here, and you're going to work on uh, phonemic sounds, and kind of polish the reading skills. that's still general education. It's fully able to be served in the gen ed. And then ultimately, I just want to highlight, and this isn't, again, looking at the school district negatively, it's just kind of giving you a better, understanding of what these things mean for school districts. Gen Ed and Gen Ed with supports is the cheapest way, most inexpensive, not cheapest, most inexpensive way to fund a child's education and be able to kind of cast this wide net to be able to support as many learners as we can in the continuum without having to spend extra money. A lot of the times in the MOUs of these teachers, these supports in the gen ed are embedded into their contract, right? Is they are providing these intervention supports within the gen ed, and that's not outside their job description. A little bit further up the continuum, and this is sometimes driven by, a doctor's note or a diagnosis, something that you're noticing at home, a therapist recommendation is Section 504 plan. And we'll get in the middle in a minute to, discussing what that means. But typically, the regulations and rules and expectations surrounding the procedures of a Section 504 plan are a little bit less legally bound for a school district to abide by. Like, they have to meet once a year. That's a typical Section 504 plan. And it's typically, looking at that diagnosis or that recommendation for a 504 from an outside provider or doctor, like I shared. And then it's building a plan as best they can to support that learner still in the general education, but ultimately, there has to be a general education teacher at a Section 504 meeting. But for our kids in middle school and high school, sometimes, all due respect to PE, we love PE. Sometimes it's just like the PE teacher and like the assistant principal. It's like, well, hold on. There's a math deficit here. I was just at a 504 plan meeting before this past school year ended. And it was like, yeah, it was like a PE teacher and the music teacher. They were lovely. They had some positive things to say, but ultimately our concerns were with like reading and then, mathematic concepts. And it was like, they can't speak to that. This isn't super beneficial. So oftentimes it's having to go out of your way as the parent advocate to request that, hey, we want, English teacher to be there. That would be great. We want, so and so to be there as well. We request that their outside therapists come attend to with, on a release of information. Ultimately, though, that Section 504 plan, how I see it, I used to be a 504 coordinator when I was an assistant principal. It was another little woven job piece of my job description was being a 504 coordinator. But ultimately, we look at that as, and this is taught sometimes to administrators, is like you need to be moving your arm, right? For a 504, you're getting the recommendation, the disability, and you are acting on it. We need to hold a meeting. We need to try these accommodations, right? It's building in that system of support. But oftentimes it's not like, throwing a dart at the target and getting it right. Sometimes these accommodations work and it's enough to get, extra time on tests. But ultimately, what I see oftentimes with the 504 plan is we don't have full team collaboration on this, and it's not implemented all the time with fidelity. Um, Ultimately, it is the district's or the school's responsibility to give a copy of the signed 504 plan to all of the students' teachers and people that work with that student at the school. Um, for example, middle school, high school, and there's multiple teachers. But that's the expectation. Working at the site level, sometimes it doesn't happen in a timely manner. Sometimes it takes a parent to be like, "Hey, does Miss Becky?" I don't know why I keep using Miss Becky. Does Miss Becky is she aware of Johnny's extra time accommodation or being able to be pulled in a separate setting? And you'll see like, oh, I haven't gotten a copy of the 504 plan, and that's a problem, right? And so sometimes we need to kind of follow up on that. That's something I do as an advocate for these families is I always send like a little recap email with all the teachers attached, like, hey, per our discussion, this sounds great kind of deal. It's not passive aggressive. You're just recapping, you're kind of helping out, you're collaborating. A little further up that supportive pathway would be special education or an IEP. And we'll get into what that means, to qualify for an IEP and what an IEP actually is for a student. But ultimately, that costs the district money. They have funding to be able to implement individualized education plans. It's a separate wallet for these districts at the state and county level that they receive these funds to be able to offer these services. So one thing that I would share to parents is, because sometimes we're like, well, I don't want to be a bother to the district. There's funding for that, right? It's a set. You're not like taking the school and shaking them upside down and taking their money. It's like this is built in from the state and federal level to be able to support the need for special education for some of these students, right? One thing that we've seen in California and Nevada for sure is this idea of like over identification of students in special education. And yeah, that ends up kind of pouring out more money and kind of shaping these budgets over time. But ultimately, that was kind of one thing we saw post COVID was kind of more people qualifying for IEPs and 504s than we had seen before. But the state and federal respond to that too. So I guess all to kind of say is don't feel guilty, but understand your child and their needs and really kind of push for that, especially if these supports aren't working and there needs to be kind of a progression up the continuum. So, like we shared before, some of these I've already said, but yeah, they have different kind of forms of general education support. Um, Sometimes these supports hit it right on the head. It's like, yes, my child only needed that reading intervention. I don't want them being pulled out of the general education class. I want them around their peers, especially some of our students that have a tough time socializing or some behaviors. Maybe they mirror a lot of behaviors too. It's like, oh, if they see so and so doing that in this kind of smaller setting, then they're going to sink into that. Maybe that's our child and full gen ed with just little bits of support work great. Sometimes they don't, right? Sometimes there needs to be more support and potentially some services implemented to better meet some of these needs. But here are some examples of some general education supports that can be helpful. And this is kind of on that multiple tiered systems of support. It's that wide funnel. How can we kind of capture all of these learners that are just maybe a little bit behind here to give them that boost in the gen ed to get them to grade level or make meaningful gains? One thing that I've noticed too is working with some foster and adoptive and kinship families is these are some of the issues that we run into. We're not going to mince words, but oftentimes there's challenges surrounding, yeah, this child has attended six different schools in 4 years, which happens, right? You have records being shared from schools to districts, sometimes state, out of state. Things get lost. People, have different kind of record issues and keeping. I used to keep many of our records, cum files at the district office, and it gets wild. But yeah, sometimes we'll miss some of these reports or recommendations from different providers or adults that have worked with our children. We also see different traumas or attachment styles that yeah, maybe this child gets very used to kind of moving around and is kind of not feeling comfortable with some of these changes, and they respond to that in ways that make learning challenging. But ultimately, I think it's oftentimes the biggest thing I run into with these families is this lack of clarity behind their history, where what has worked, right? And this is sometimes even families that I work with as an advocate that are just moving to a different school within the district, and they're like, yeah, but we really want new school to understand that this is how Johnny learns. This is not how he learns. This is what really upsets him. We need this kind of environment for him. And I think it's important to say that sometimes we're the administrator or educational record holder for our child, and sometimes need to be that middle person to be able to collaborate and share what it is about our child that would be helpful for the receiving team. If you've ever worked in education, it's tough. It's tough getting a child, mid-school year. It's tough because, oftentimes you'll have the same kind of class, and then you'll have a child, new student in your class. And yeah, sometimes it is helpful to receive from the parents, like, hey, this is how they learn. This is what they do to tick. This is how to maybe address that behavior. It's all very helpful, all very helpful, but can be a challenge for sure. So, like we talked about a little bit before, MTSS is that big kind of webbed framework. It's kind of a hot item now. Too is districts in the states, they want to implement more of an everyone approach at that tier one. Is like what adjustments can we make here to generalize instruction, what adjustments can we make to generalized instruction to better support all learners, right? Rather than saying, oh, they can't do this, let's move them to a separate setting. In theory, it's a great idea. It's a very great theory. Is yes, we want to improve instruction using some of these different systems that oftentimes I coach districts up on. Is improving instruction. How can we improve instruction for all learners, right? Um, oftentimes at that kind of tier one, tier two level, principals, especially at elementary schools, it's oftentimes that they're the only administrator there. Is the principal at a medium sized or smaller elementary school. Is they'll keep like a spreadsheet sheet, like a MTSS like journal, where it has all of these kids that are kind of on the radar, and then they're monitoring over time. Some of the best principals I've worked with, when I was working at the district office, was they knew what kids were on kind of that target that they needed to be tracking over the course of those quarters in the school year. But ultimately, sometimes our kids, are very quiet or kind of able to blend in. No disrespect to the teachers, but sometimes the teachers have a lot on their plate too, and they don't even notice, our child struggling in this area. So oftentimes we need to be the ones that are bringing those concerns to the table to put them on that radar and kind of get them to that tier two level to maybe qualify for some reading intervention there. But ultimately, I got a tier three would be more intensive interventions, such as a potential 504 plan or assessment for special education. We can kind of get into that in a moment. But again, it's MTSS is it's not a special ed program. It's more of a general education kind of framework or funnel to look at these things through. So some of you might be wondering, okay, is my kid, if you're not, don't have a 504, if you don't, have an IEP, is like, how do I know? How do I know if gen ed isn't enough? Here's some things to really kind of look at is, are we seeing some stagnant reading, right? Are we not progressing? Maybe we're at that second or third grade level and kind of plateauing a little bit, and we're seeing kind of these issues. You don't have to be a reading intervention specialist to understand if your kid isn't making improvement in these areas. Are behavior issues kind of continuing, and are they not contingent upon a particular transition time? Some kids don't transition well from recess to back to the classroom, right? Some of that is age appropriate and normal. Still, not to pat it on its head, we need to look at those things and monitor. But ultimately, if we see like behavior regressing or things continuing as we're kind of implementing these tier one strategies to support, anxiety and stress increase, right? A lot of our kiddos that we're fostering or have adopted, have some trauma that we're not even fully informed about, and we see that kind of rear its head the older our child gets. Um, Again, too, attendance, it's real. We can be the best parents in the world, and sometimes it's darn near impossible to get our kids to school, right? That's a challenge that oftentimes we need the school or the district to come alongside us and help, right? That general education might not be enough. If you're one of those families that gets frequent calls from the school, right? And they're not just, maybe the teacher out of the goodness of her heart, calling you to tell you, happy things, which, sometimes happens. Sometimes it's, more than not happy things. And you're like, oh my gosh. Um, maybe that's an indication as well. Another thing that is very challenging for my daughter too is daily homework, right? Even in second grade, there's oftentimes a lot of homework, and she's like, I was just at school, like doing all this. I don't want to have to do more of this. Some of that's age appropriate, normal. But maybe there's a huge avoidance, and it almost turns into behavior when you're looking at, working at on academics at home. These are some potential indicators to look at when you're evaluating if general education is enough. So, a couple different paths, and I want to kind of distinguish the differences that matter. I feel like for families here is, a Section 504 plan is implemented in the general education. Um, Many districts are starting to offer counseling um, and mental health therapy check-ins without goals, but these check-ins to be offered still with the 504 plan. Okay, so I'm wary to say that, no services of any kind can be offered with the 504 plan. That's not entirely true. But ultimately, the vague look at a 504 plan, there's a disability that impacts learning, right? And we need the school to be aware and flagged of said disability or a health concern, right? And we need the school team to collaborate with us as parents to be able to build a plan that has accommodations, kind of these tier two, tier three MTSS supports to better help my child access their learning environment. Right. I think that's the big thing with a 504 plan is how can the school partner with us to better help my student or child access their learning at school. And that might be academic, it might also be social too, right? Is that's a big concern, especially for our kiddos, with autism or social disorders that, score fine academically, but socializing is an area of concern, right? And it's sometimes an impactor that doesn't allow them to fully engage with school and do school, right? And so these are some things that might rise to the level where asking for a 504 plan to implement where we keep our kiddo in the general education with these accommodations like, extra time and, uh, pulling into a separate setting to test some of these mental health check-ins, right? All can be served under a 504 plan. Special education and IEP is a more restrictive placement. And that's the terminology that state and federal uses is, least restrictive environment, LRE. I'm sure some of you have heard that terminology before. Least restrictive environment just indicates that, based on this child's need and recommendations from the school or district, we're able to support this kiddo with these services, goals, and supports uh, in the least restrictive environment possible. If the least restrictive environment is the general education, and the most restrictive environment, which I'll get into in a second, is like a separate school, right, where we're working on specific behaviors, which some of my families I work with have students in a non-public school or a private school that they need that, right? They cannot at this point participate in even a special day class at a comprehensive school district. And so the school district, refers them out to and pays for them to attend kind of a special school that specializes in these areas that student has trouble accessing. But special education is a more restrictive environment, and there needs to be some level of service. There needs to be an identified need that there's a service attached to that. There's goals monitoring that are addressing how we're going to move this student how we're going to grow in these areas. They're not just random goals that are attached to a need. They're supposed to build momentum to be able to move this child toward growth in these areas. And then oftentimes there's specialized academic instruction. Some of our states have IEPs for kids with speech only needs. Maybe there's an articulation need. We're not saying our sounds appropriately, and we're in fourth or fifth grade, but then no other concerns related to academics are presenting. Sometimes these districts or schools or states will author an IEP just based off of speech only, where that speech pathologist is your case manager. And there's just kind of speech goals. Oftentimes those IEPs are thinner too. So yeah, both are good. They just solve different kind of concerns and different areas of need. Like I shared before, it's really kind of giving that boost in a 504 plan. This is not limited to any one of these conditions, but oftentimes I see ADHD, anxiety, other health related concerns that need a health plan. Maybe there's medication administered by a school health professional or a nurse, oftentimes. Yeah, those are definitely qualifying conditions for a 504 plan. Um, Oftentimes it only takes a letter from a provider saying Johnny has ADHD and benefits from some extra time in these areas. Most of the time these health providers are willing to write these, especially if they're something along the lines of asthma, epilepsy, something that's going to impact their day that they need to be pulled out and to take a medication for. But typically 504 plans should require some level of documentation that'll get you through the door quicker. Some examples though of accommodations, and this is I love this one because sometimes this is all some of our kids need is yes, extra time breaks during testing. Sometimes it's a movement break, right? Sometimes that classroom doesn't even provide a level of break, right? It's like the kiddo is in second grade, 8 years old, and they know that they're going to be sitting in that seat for 3 hours, right? Because we have circle time, we have reading time. I know as a kid myself, I would be going crazy, right? I would be going absolutely crazy if I knew on my radar, I still go crazy, right? Is if I know that I'm going to have to sit there for 3 hours, yeah, I'm going to start wiggling and taking my own breaks. I'm going to go get a tissue probably 3 times. I'm going to ask for a drink of water. What if we built those movement breaks in? That's definitely something that we could still capture in the general education environment with movement breaks. Great. Preferential seating. Sometimes we have attention concerns or we're hard of hearing. um, Sometimes preferential seating is more than appropriate, right? Is maybe one ear works better. They need to have in their 504 plan that they're seated on this side of the room, next to the teacher. Maybe some of our kiddos do better being in the front row as much as some of our kiddos hate being on the front row, right? Well, sometimes that minimizes distraction. Sometimes kiddos, with anxiety and trauma, don't want to be in the front row. They're on display, right? We maybe back is appropriate. Maybe to the side of the room is appropriate, so they can kind of be able to see what's going on. But yeah, some of these preferential seating pieces are not necessarily what's preferred by the child. That's oftentimes our role or responsibility as parents or advocates to be able to better support these kiddos with working with the school to be like, hey, let's try this. Another great 504 accommodation, especially for our older kiddos in middle school and high school, especially copies of the notes, right? Teacher might have gone through the notes and have the notes prepared after, maybe being able to receive said notes after instruction to be able to patch in on their own later, study those after. Sometimes note taking is a very, very challenging skill for a lot of our kiddos. Um, Different embedded environmental supports, which are huge, especially for our kiddos with sensory concerns. Noise reduction headphones, put it in the 504. Visual is scheduled presence. Sometimes, what I see is the, lower elementary school, and I've worked at all the different levels of middle, high, and elementary school. sometimes I really like to think of our younger classrooms, our kinder first and second grade classrooms as our big leagues, right? They do instruction really well. All these environmental supports are there. They got a visual schedule. They got the agenda present, right? They have all of these different visuals to guide learning and engagement, right? And then you get to some of these middle school and high school classrooms. No disrespect, I've been a co-teacher or the full-time teacher for some of these classrooms where yeah, I fall asleep on some of these visuals, right? Because it's like, well, hold on, we're getting a little bit older. Some of our kids need those visual schedules. So putting those in their 504 or their IEP as an accommodation are huge. Some of our kids get very hangry, right? Some of our kids need uh, the, I know this seems kind of different, but the emotional support of being able to take a water break, right? Or have access to their water bottle, have access to eating a snack outside, whatever that looks like. Nurse visits too, like we had shared before. That's a huge one, right? Is sometimes, there's some trauma there that it's like anytime I go to the nurse, I'm going to get looked down upon, for complaining, right? Is building these supports into the 504 to better support learning. Special education, one of the directors I used to work with back when I first started teaching said, needs should drive the services. The needs of a child should drive the services and the goals that are established to be able to support that kiddo. And so ultimately an IEP is the plan that explains how are we going to address these needs. Yes, we've gone through the assessment process, we've received the diagnosis, we have a recommendation for these services and supports. What is the plan to get us gains and progress us? And sometimes the goal is not necessarily grade level. And I think that really, frustrates families sometimes, and sometimes teachers too, as they have their dashboard that they're trying to, take these computerized tests too, and be like, yes, we've all arrived at grade level for reading, right? I have, been crowned the greatest teacher. Like sometimes these students, are not going to meet grade level, and that's okay. It's we want to see progress though. And if we're not seeing progress, then there needs to be an amendment or revision to that IEP um, to better meet those needs to drive the services and those goals. I'm going to kind of jam through this part, but I think it's important to conceptually understand the process of an IEP. There needs to be a level. I wish I put like a little 0 0 here. There needs to be a referral for assessment, a request for assessment, right? Oftentimes this is not, it can come from the school or the district or somebody that works at the school. In a perfect world, the teacher's like, hey, we've tried these reading interventions for Johnny. They have not worked. I've tried these supports. We've met for a little parent teacher conference. We've tried these different, solutions. I would recommend that we move toward assessment for special education. The parent would need to sign off on that, obviously, before they move forward. Um, but more often than not, it comes from an advocate or the parents themselves saying, hey there, we've tried X, Y, and Z. We have a documented, disability, or we don't, but we have a documented disability that dictates that, we might want to look under the hood here, and assess for special education services at the school level. That's what we're requesting. Um, One thing that I want to be kind of very clear of is, and this gets families very frustrated, right? Is like, hold on, we went to do Kaiser, we assessed, they did the ASRS, they said my child has autism, right? You need to give him an IEP. It doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way in any state. Each district would need to still, yes, they can use those assessment results to better inform their own assessment. They need to run their own assessment to determine, does that disability or diagnosis impact their educational access or their social access, right? Sometimes anxiety can be a determining factor to qualifying for, an IEP under, sometimes emotional disturbance, other health impairment. Ultimately, though, the district needs to confirm that that outside diagnosis, this concern impacts their education, their access here. And if they find that it doesn't, right, then you have, a student with autism that does not qualify for an IEP because their autism doesn't, in the school's mind, doesn't impact their learning to the extent that would require the authoring of an IEP. Maybe they feel like they can handle it in the MTSS process, frequent breaks, right? Movement breaks, extra time, some of these accommodations. But I just wanted to be very clear on, just because you went, and sometimes parents do this, they spend, they break the bank, they spend a lot of money to get these outside professional assessments, right? They bring it to the school, like, here, take it, establish our IEP. They say, hold on, we'll take that, but we have to run our own assessment. And that can be very frustrating. Not to say that outside private assessments are a bad thing, but ultimately, if it's the only step you're trying to take to get your kiddo an IEP, it's a weak case. Ultimately, once they, conduct their assessments at the school site level, then you would meet for an initial IEP meeting where they would share the report, the big long report, and then they would determine, supposed to be collaborative team discussion, if the kiddo meets eligibility to qualify for an IEP. And these services and goals, like we had shared, these goals are to meet those educational areas of need that were found as recommended areas of needs in the assessment. These goals are not just random. They're not just like parents saying, hey, we think he needs to, make friends better. That needs to come up in their assessment report as an area of concern in order for them to write goals. In the last couple of years, I've really seen districts push back on just kind of writing in goals based off of what the parents want. It has to be an area of concern that was highlighted in the assessment. The services also need to address these areas as well. The progress monitoring is a big part. They'll share with you what their goals, where they're at with their goals, and if anything needs to be revised, that will come up to at the annual IEP when they share the progress that's been made in that year. I'm going to kind of pick up the pace a little bit here. We shared a lot of this already, but here's, a couple of the qualifying areas of eligibility for an IEP. I highlighted other health impairment here because that's a big umbrella that can capture a lot of different things, right? If there's a physical diagnosis of something that's health related, ADHD actually is under that umbrella. It's one of our kind of bigger umbrella categories for special education is other health impairment, which would capture ADHD. And like I've shared before, the diagnosis alone does not automatically qualify the student. They have to run their own assessment and determine if it impacts his educational access or performance. A couple myths versus facts. Like we shared before, no, just because they have ADHD does not necessarily mean they get an IEP, right? Students may qualify, but again, it's based off of access. Schools always know and evaluate. We already highlighted that. Sometimes it happens when you have the all-star teacher, and then sometimes, that's your responsibility as the parent or partner. Another myth is that, okay, you got to agree today and sign consent. No, absolutely not. In fact, I would advise you not to do that. Sometimes they change things too in the final draft. Get a look at that before you sign consent. They have a lot of digital docu-signs they could go through as well. So we already discussed this a little bit, but here's a closer look as how the services would begin to be implemented. The federal requirement is a 60-day timeline to from the time that you sign the assessment plan. The district or the school has 60 days to conduct their assessments and share their recommendations with you. Sometimes it's sooner. Like we shared before too, and I kind of really focus on a couple key areas here that I haven't touched on. Present levels. Present levels isn't just a summary or a progress report as far as like where your kiddo's at. Present levels really highlight, strengths, yes, but concerns. This is a huge part where parent concerns are located in the IEP, and the school or district's obligation is to work toward resolving said parent concern. It goes into the IEP. Some of the strongest IEPs have parent concerns that are not just relevant, but require some level of action from the school or district to address said concern. Another area here is that we look at too is placement. That's a whole nother probably webinar. But placement is where is my child being served? What type of classroom? Is it general education with some special education supports? Is it a special day class? Is it outside of the school district at a non-public school or a specialized school? Like I shared before too, this is not just a highlight of where the kiddo's at, but it's addressing some of these areas of concern, not just from the parent, but where the school also sees concern too. Maybe this is where some of the executive functioning and organizational concerns go in from the teacher. We want to encourage them to be honest too and share, what does work completion look like? How much are they getting done? How many missing assignments do they have? It's not a beaten down kind of document, but it's a real valid document that is showing where we're at so that we can make some meaningful progress. Like I shared before, these goals in the IEP need to be measurable. And this is an area where I see a lot of schools and districts needing some support. And this is where an advocate, I think, for some of these families has come in handy, is being able to, write some meaningful goals based off of their own recommendations from their assessments, from the concerns that we're hearing from the teachers too. What do we need to actually work on? Here's some different services like we shared. Could be speech, occupational therapy, working on fine motor coordination, gross motor coordination. Also it can be sensory related. It doesn't have to be, oh, Johnny just can't hold the pencil. It could be related to their sensory output. He needs sensory breaks, needs to be in his IEP. We need an occupational therapist to establish like a little sensory routine throughout the day. Counseling can be a service in an IEP or a 504, like we shared. Behavioral services, administered through a behavior intervention support technician or a board certified behavior analyst, like the behavior manager. SAI, specialized academic instruction to support some of these academic areas of concern. I coupled APE, adaptive PE, and physical therapy together because sometimes these go hand in hand too. So maybe there's an orthopedic impairment, something that's not age appropriate, that's requiring specialized support in these areas. And then transportation is also a service. Some of our kiddos qualify for curb to curb transportation. Talked a little bit about this before, but accommodations are kind of, how we're arriving at these learning goals. The modifications are oftentimes changing, the goalpost. Sometimes it's changing, the academic expectation. Maybe it's reducing the curriculum. Maybe it's doing every other math problem on a test. Maybe it's, assessed for understanding, not mastery. I've seen that as a modification as well. Like we shared a couple times throughout here, is this is kind of the continuum of support. This is the continuum of support for most districts in the United States. Gen Ed, there's Gen Ed with supports like we shared. It could capture a 504 plan. There's full inclusion. Maybe there's some parent educator support in that classroom. Maybe there's some resource support in that classroom. Special day class, maybe a smaller setting with more adult support. There's county programs, there's non-public schools, and then there are some cases where, home hospital instruction is necessary for some of our students that, I've worked with a couple families that have students that, have needs like a breathing machine or different concerns that wouldn't allow them to attend a generalized setting like that. Also, looking at trauma, I think sometimes we get lost in the sauce of, these concerns, but really, stepping back and looking at how trauma can actually affect learning, right? It can impact, right? It can impact memory. It can impact these attention areas. It can impact for sure emotional regulation. I'm sure some of us have seen, but then also organization, focusing on kind of the things that we need to focus on, right? I shared this also before, but behavior is oftentimes communication. Sometimes I think as parents, it's easy to really look at like, why is my kid doing this? Oh, they're just trying to get difficult. Well, oftentimes they're trying to communicate something, right? It could be escaping from a challenging task. It could be, I'm frustrated, I don't understand this. I don't know. I'm just going to do something else, right? Could be confused. It could be too like I don't know how to communicate this, so I'm going to, run out of class, right? I'm going to react in this way. I'm going to say these words. I think to when to request an evaluation, when to move up on this continuum is when we're looking at these academic struggles, when we're looking at some of these physical concerns too related to sensory, fine gross motor, um, and then if we're seeing that, yeah, we're well behind in grade level or developmental, that's some areas that I think that should be looked at maybe a little closer. And the worst that can happen is they, move forward the evaluation for special education. We don't qualify, but then we get more information on that, how to better support our student there. Here's some kind of proactive pieces to potentially bring to the meeting, some questions to ask regarding decisions and progress. What data supports that decision? Another one would be, how are we going to measure progress here? We don't have to be confrontational. It's genuinely trying to understand, like, how do we know if we have arrived here? Another option is a great. This is a great one to ask. Is what options kind of were considered when arriving, at this decision? What options were considered here? Some districts will, not answer this next one, but what happens if progress isn't made? I've heard we don't have a crystal ball. We can't go there. Well, help me understand though. I want to better understand what our guardrails are here, right? What happens if progress isn't made here? What do we do? What should I expect to see before our next meeting? Great question. What's our goalpost? Many of our goals have benchmarks attached to them in some of our states and districts. Like, how do I know if we're making progress? How do I know if we need to revisit? Another great one, parent friendly. Can you explain that in everyday language? I don't understand those acronyms or that, assessment battery tool. Can you explain this in everyday language for me? Write down some questions too. If you get that report before the meeting, write down some questions. Kim, I know that we're going a little bit over here. I'll stay on for the whole time to answer any questions for anybody who wants to stay over, but I just have a couple more slides here.
No problem.
Yeah. Couple things to potentially bring to a meeting. You don't want to be overloaded. Maybe a stress ball too, a little sensory tool for yourself. But yeah, bring some questions. Bring a notebook. Active engagement at a meeting does not mean, you know, I need to dispute everything to show them that I care and I understand like the curveballs they're trying to throw me. It's important to listen. It's important to ask appropriate questions to better understand, right? Ask to clarify unfamiliar words. You're not dumb for asking a question about something that you don't understand. That's smart. We want to understand what's being discussed. And then from the self advocacy side as a parent, never feel pressured. I know sometimes it feels like a monologue that they're throwing a bunch of different, reports at you. You don't have to be pressured to assign that. Yes, you can ask it for a copy to review prior to signature or consent. You can also sign consent with exception to parts of the IEP. District doesn't typically disclose that, but yeah, we might agree on, services in all these areas, but not these goals here, right? That's fine. You could sign with exception to that and still implement and get going the rest of the IEP. And then we want to stay collaborative. These are the people that are working with our kids, right? We want to work with them as well. Like I shared before, reviewing the documents after. Send that per our discussion email, right? It's like, hey, I just by said date we should have an idea of blah blah blah, right? We discussed that, this accommodation will be implemented. I'm excited to see that, reflected in the IEP. Maybe that's the time too, is, maybe you don't have an advocate or an attorney, attend your meeting with you. Maybe it's just having them review some of these documents afterward and giving you, their 2 cents and kind of their opinion or input and recommendation off that doc. A lot of my parents don't even have me in the kind of middle ground. They just have me in their back pocket to review documents and then kind of type them an email to kind of copy and paste and send to the district on their behalf. Save your emails. A lot of times the district's email database resets, and then should they be audited on that, it's unavailable. Save your email, save your communication threads. Whether or not you decide to work with an advocate on your case or an attorney, it's important for you to have documented what was communicated. Couple red flags to watch out for is repeated suspensions for sure, right? There's a process called the manifestation determination process, the MD process, that seeks that if a student is suspended 10 times, there needs to be like a special hearing with the school psychologist there to determine whether or not that student's suspensions are a manifestation or driven by their disability. If the answer is no, then it resets. I mean, if the answer is yes, then it resets. If the answer is no, then, oftentimes our kids can be expelled from a district if they've been suspended enough times. So these are concerns that you would, bring to the table to be, looked at, especially if you're getting these calls home. If you're having your students say all the time that they don't want to go to school, it's not happening. A lot of kids don't like to go to school, but there is a threshold where it is a concern to put on the radar of the school counselor, to have a safe check-in person, to have the school be aware. Also, I think really looking at through the lens of progress, right? If we're seeing little to no academic progress in these areas, if you're hearing wait and see, let's wait, another semester, let's see kind of what happens. Sometimes that's not where we're at. Sometimes it's in the district and the school's best interest to kind of slow things down. Sometimes for us in our individual cases, it's not. We talked about a lot of this already, but really try to stay collaborative. Ask questions, right? Sometimes it's tough to stay calm, but it's important to stay collaborative and assume best intentions when we can. Just a little kind of piece on what I do is I better understand the evaluations and kind of share with the parents and parent friendly language, like what's going on, what the recommendations are, what are the concerns or the gaps that I'm seeing. I review these documents. I help the parents organize questions. I help prepare them to better advocate for their child. Sometimes I am the one talking too. Sometimes the parents would prefer me to be kind of the one in the middle asking these questions and advocating. And we meet prior to discuss, calibration, where we're at and what they would like me to advocate for. And I also help kind of explain these unorthodox terms or jargon, as we would say in education. But ultimately, I think a big part of my role is, sometimes I'll deal with parents that are very frustrated, school districts that are very frustrated. I'm really trying to kind of mediate that and navigate these disagreements and try to land that plane. Right? It's our kids' progress and education at stake here, so we want to land this plane and make it work for both sides for sure. Some helpful resources for you. Definitely foster the family. There's rights law. There's understood.org, your state Department of Ed, PTIs, parent training info centers, trusted person that works in special education. Some of these districts and schools also, produce different parent nights and stuff. Go to them. Throw your face in there. You want to be an established person that is a part of the community too. That's learning how the district, does things as well. Three last things that I hope you remember today. You definitely don't have to understand everything. Gotta ask questions and inquire until things make sense to you. And you're a very important member of the IEP team. You are. In many states, they have you check a box that would share as a parent that you felt like you were a meaningful contributor to the IEP meeting that day. So they often, many states and districts have you check that box to say, yeah, I do feel like I was a valued team member today and collaborated. And if the answer is no, then it's something that they have to seek to resolve. Okay, sorry for the lag there, but we finished 10 minutes late. That's fine. I'll stay on as long as people have questions here. All right. Um, do you want to, let's see, I can pull up my little, why don't we raise our hand? Do you have the little hand raising feature? And then Kim, if I miss anybody, just throw a pen at me from Florida to California.
Sounds good.
Okay. I'm here to answer any questions. Maybe they're generalized. If there's specific questions related to your case too, I'm open to that too. Thank you, Heather.
I will start off if nobody else has one right away. So I know you gave the timing for from when assessment is done. They have 60 days to respond with the plan and everything. What about when you request an evaluation? Is there a certain amount of time they
Yeah,
have to complete that evaluation?
good question. So when you request assessment, they have 15 days to do one of two things. Either issue you the assessment plan saying, sure, we're going to assess in these areas, sign this off, mom. Uh, the other option would be by that 15-day timeline, they would have to give you a PWN or a prior written notice saying, we're going to decline your assessment request for these reasons. This is what we're going to do instead. Um, but ultimately, if they do, does that answer your question, or was your question more about timeline of conducting and holding a meeting for the assessment?
Actually both, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah,
So because for instance, we had a situation where I requested one and then it was like 3 months later was when we actually had the evaluation. Is that within an okay timeline? Like not knowing what the expectation is.
yeah, for sure. Okay, so now moving on, let's say that they did issue the assessment plan. They're like, sure, we're going to assess. And then it's like, what the heck? Why is this taking so long? Um, you would need to look at your state's 60-day timeline. And then that would determine, because it does exclude breaks and holidays, but ultimately, 3 months, depending on the breaks and holidays, that does sound like it's getting to time, but it could be within that 60-day timeline. Um, if they break timeline, so ultimately what we see is, yeah, it's about that like 50 to 60-day limit that they would conduct the assessment, share the recommendation results. However, Ken, this is a big thing to kind of be mindful of as a team too. Many times, the speech pathologist, for example, well, I'm not done with my assessment. I had all these things and I didn't do it. Well, oftentimes what the district will try to do, and you do not have to agree to this, you can, but they might say, we're going to open up the meeting and share the psych report, and then we'll meet for a part two to share the speech pathologist reports. Um, if you agree to that as a parent, then it's fine. If you don't, then they're out of compliance. They're out of compliance because they didn't conduct. So what could have happened with yours too is not everyone was done and they just wanted to hold it all together. But I would have to look at the dates and times to determine if they were out of compliance there.
Okay.
But yeah, under 60 days is typically the regulation.
Okay, good to know. Thank you.
Elsie shared, can you discuss some services or English language learners are done? Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So oftentimes, in a couple different states I've worked in, um, they will offer designated English language learner support, whether or not you are on an IEP or a 504. If you are a designated ELL, then what that means is it's flagged kind of in their little database that the teachers could see, right? But then ultimately, there needs to be some level of assessment that they conduct for the child, um, that would determine the biggest areas that they need to grow in, whether that be speech, listening, reading, writing. And then ultimately, they'll build different supports into the class. When we get to junior high, middle school, and high school, one of the biggest, if you're in a particular tier, let's call it, different states do it differently, but let's call it tier two ELD support for speaking and reading and writing. Well, that student might qualify for or be recommended to take like an English language development class and or an English language speaking class in addition to that. And that actually does count as, potentially 1 to 2 courses on their schedule and would replace their general education English class. That's an example for a secondary student. But that's a really good question to ask your district too, is say, hey, my kiddo's a designated ELL. What supports or assessment tools can you conduct to determine what our needs are so that we can better support not just at home, but at school? Does that kind of answer your question, Elsie? Cool. Okay. Bethany.
Hello. Thank you for
Hi.
doing this, first of all. So glad
Yeah.
to be a part of it. So I'm curious in regards to, as a parent, do we have the right in an IEP meeting to make specific requests regarding interactions with our child and
Hmm.
the resource officer or whoever that person is on the school grounds?
Absolutely. And without digging too deep, I would assume what I'm hearing is there might be some anxiety or trauma provoking pieces related to talking to my child this way will yield this type of response or reaction. So to try to nip that in the bud, can we go about it this way? Absolutely. And if anything, as a former administrator, I would find that super helpful. Is I'm sure that they're trying to get it right, but then their little procedure is, well, no, we send out Mr. Johnson, and he like confronts it this way. So ultimately, absolutely. And I think if you do put that in the IEP, that could be in the present levels section, to determine, is it a 504 or an IEP?
IEP.
Yeah, so if it's an IEP, I would put it in the present level section and the notes section. And, depending on where they're willing to put it, I would see some districts or states put it in as present levels saying, hey, this is an area where social emotionally, there's a section social emotional. They do not respond well in this way. Offer said, and that might be your job too, as mom, to be able to say, this is better. Can you please put this uh, way with my limited information here, this way in the IEP to better address these types of concerns? If they're not willing to put it in the social emotional section, you could put it in as a parent concern section and saying, I am concerned that when, my child is addressed in this way, what we've seen is this type of response. But ultimately, I would find that they would put that in the present level section. And then in addition to that, it might even be relevant to capture in the goals too. Is maybe that's an area that you're working on, not the way that they've been working on it or addressing it, but to try to build capacity in, receiving instructions from staff members. But ultimately, I think capturing that in the present levels as highlight, and this might be you writing it to an email saying, I would like for you to amend the IEP and put this in the present level section in this area that they struggle with receiving, this type of communication, and this would be better. They'll
Mhm.
probably just put it in there if you're very specific in that way. But if you do have a meeting, it really hash out and explain like why this is, concerning and how this impacts our child for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah. We have
Yeah,
a meeting next week, so I'm trying to
perfect.
brace
Yeah.
myself.
That could also too, Bethany, sorry, last thing, that could also be captured too as an accommodation, right?
Okay.
But you need to do a little bit of homework though, and kind of think on it, on what would be the positive way to accommodate or address said concern. What's the different avenue then to get done what the school is trying to get done with their way of approaching that, if that makes sense?
Does
Uh,
inevitably my goal would be for them to build rapport between
right.
him and the resource officer. Can we do that? Can we build trust so that he isn't fearful when
Yeah.
it's time to interact? And that can be a positive exchange rather than detrimental.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That would definitely, you said it best, is right there is rapport building, and maybe it's conversational interactions with said staff member without giving a name but giving a title. Absolutely, that could be established as a goal or accommodation for sure.
Thank you.
Good question. Yeah. Don't be afraid to ask.
I didn't, well, can I go
Yeah,
ahead? It's pretty quiet.
absolutely.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Holly. My little guy is about to turn 3, and he's had his eval with the public schools for special ed and preschool. And our initial eval meeting is next Monday. Um, I'm wondering, one of the things that I'm most concerned about is here in our city, we have a full day preschool program, and I have a feeling that's what they'll recommend. But he still naps. And so is it reasonable to ask for a modified or shortened day, at least for a period of time? Um, yeah.
It's
What
a
do you,
very good question.
okay.
Yeah, absolutely, because what we're doing here is we want, and I'm just kind of, this is how I kind of conceptualize. We want said kiddo to experience school. We want our kiddo to go to school. We're not trying to like withhold our kiddo because we don't trust you guys kind of deal. Because that's where I hear like attendance concerns come into play. I think it is very reasonable if nap time is something at this age that will not allow them to attend school. I think it's a very reasonable approach to ask for a modified day. Is it just they just like their nap, or is there something health related connected to the
Um,
nap?
I mean, he's little, so
He's a little, yeah,
yeah, he needs the nap. He's not ready to drop it, and they don't do any nap or rest time at preschool. In fact, they've told me they do the services then. But if he's not available, he doesn't have the bandwidth for services
yeah,
at that time, it's going to be counterproductive. Um,
yeah.
yeah.
I think getting into that scheduling conversation is reasonable. I think it
Hmm.
is, right?
Okay.
I don't think it's unreasonable. I used to work at the preschool assessment center, and they had in California, they had two different start time. There's two different cohorts. There's the morning cohort, and then there's an afternoon cohort. So that's addressing exactly what you're saying. It's like, yes, some
Hmm.
kids nap at
Yeah.
this time. It's not going to work. So I think bringing that up, um, and then I think my advice to you would be do your homework as parent to establish what times of the day we are able to do this works for us here. So it's not just like, well, he naps, in the middle of the day, or she naps during the middle of the day. Sorry, kind of deal. Have what you're able to do so that they can work off of that to provide services. That would be my recommendation.
Okay,
Yeah,
great.
but I think it's reasonable, Holly. Yeah, good question.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Alexandra as DCF also requires that children have an area to rest in their classroom. Yeah, I mean, it could be a downtime, could be a sleep, could be needs to go to sleep though too. But yeah, I know that there's no nap time now in California as well. But we're little still, right? It's not, if we were having this conversation in third grade, this would be a different conversation for sure. But yeah,
I actually wanted to jump in with another question.
of course.
Yeah, definitely appreciated your response. Our situation is we actually live in Honduras currently and have fostered our finishing our adoption and moving back to the United States. So I'm working on figuring out how to enroll all of my kids in school as close to the beginning of the school year as possible as we're still finishing our adoption. And I've reached
Mm.
out to CHOP, Children's Hospital of Pennsylvania, to kind of review some things. In their referral documents, their assessments are 2 years old at this point. So because we currently have custody of them, we are working on like doing all of their evaluations again to
Yeah.
get their diagnoses updated. My daughter has more severe special
Mhm.
needs, more just like intellectual disability kind of consideration. So we're getting that like officially diagnosed so that when we come back, we can give that to the school and get her right into a special needs classroom. I assume is how that works, but honestly, I don't know. I assume when we enroll our kids in school, we present that documentation and then will they still do their own evaluations?
Yeah, so sorry, can I back up? Who
Yes.
would be
Sorry.
conducting that assessment that you shared
In
before?
Honduras. In Honduras is what I am doing currently by a licensed child psychologist, and then having some things reviewed by CHOP just so that they can give us like recommendations. Is kind of like what they do for international
Yeah.
adoption. And then who I also like, she will be an English language learner. So will her biological brother, who we're also adopting. It's just his needs aren't
Hmm.
as severe. So I was not
Yeah.
going to get his evaluation done until
School could run it.
he right, because the more
Yeah.
concern is the English language learning, and then from there we'll address other
Yeah.
delays in his
Yeah.
learning, right?
But daughter has
Yes,
so,
yes.
okay, now I understand the nature of the question. Sorry to cut you off.
That's fine.
So yeah, what these schools and states and districts can do is they can receive what you have from outside. And if
Mm-hmm.
there's a clear cut need where it's like, okay, we are not just going to put this kiddo in like a general ed class and
Right.
like, here, let's see how it works for the next 60 days. They have the jurisdiction to give an interim offer. And that's something you can ask for is like an interim placement offer, um, to work with the child as they are pending their own assessment. They will, I'm not your special ed director at the receiving school district, but ultimately they will want to conduct their own assessment as well. It is not a bad thing that you're doing the outside assessment there in Honduras, but ultimately they will want to assess. But for your daughter, they might have the ability, they should have the ability to give some level of an interim offer. I would get that enrollment ball rolling probably now, though, to give the district office special education um, a heads up so that they can now be really kind of prepared to, okay, we're receiving this kid. It's a unique situation. That's what these interim offers are for, is a unique situation where they're coming from a different country with some assessment data. We're going to have to run our own assessment. We understand that as a family. However, this is a special circumstance where you guys are going to need to offer kind of something with the information that you have on hand, if that makes sense. So I would, I'm sure you're on the ball and getting in front of it, but ultimately I would probably give district office of special education a shout, to just share exactly kind of what you shared and where we're at and what our expectation is and what we're doing right now. Um, but no, I think that sounds reasonable too for the son related to getting the ELL support and kind of going through the scope of their own assessment at the school level too. Does that kind of address your question?
Yeah. Yeah, I did reach out to the school district and they said, you because we don't have a date for returning to the US yet, it should be sometime in September, which is like at the beginning of the school
Mhm.
year. They were like, wait until you're back in the States and then go through the enrollment on the website and then they'll, like they'll figure out what teams need to be in play or whatever. But I do feel like because I'll be enrolling two children who are going to be needing like special services that, I should give them more of a heads up. I just wasn't sure what documentation the school district requires that I could do in country here in Honduras where it's cheaper versus and get it translated, versus doing it in the US where it would cost us money.
Yeah. What you said something about a 2-year old assessment.
Yeah.
Where was that assessment conducted
So that was done by social services in Honduras for their adoption documents. So their referral
in
documents,
Honduras?
which were given to us, yep, after they were assigned to us, and that kind of lists this. These are like the psychological evaluation, the needs
Yes.
of the children before you accept them as like the children you're going to adopt.
So
Um,
that's what you got then. That like it you're going above and beyond by getting them privately assessed in Honduras, but
yeah,
ultimately what you have, like if you were a parent that was not on the ball, and just
yeah,
had kind of what they had.
yeah,
That's what you got. You got a 2-year-old assessment
yeah,
recommendation, and you would provide that to the district. Like, hey, I know you told me to kind of, wait until enrollment. We're concerned though because we're coming in September. You don't have to formally give us a recommendation or a placement right now, but we want you guys to be aware that we are coming in September. Here is what we have as of now, and we have an outside, assessment being conducted that we're going to share with you. But we know, that you guys are going to have to conduct your own assessments too. Um, was it like the director of special education that you were able to reach via email, or was it like an enrollment person?
It was actually my kids are currently I have I have four children. Two of my children they are enrolled as homeschoolers in this district already. And so I reached out to the manager of the homeschool and I was like for the district. And I was like, we are moving home. All of my children are going to be enrolled. Should I start getting that ball rolling? And she told me to wait until we are in country to
I
enroll,
would
but
hit
maybe
up
I reach out personally to like
special
the
ed.
principal of the elementary
Yeah.
school or something and give them a heads up.
I would reach out to the principal and then also special ed director person. This would be kind of my neck of the woods at my former position at the district office. Would be, yeah, I would want to know. I'd want to know because I'm going to be the one that would have to determine interim placement. Um, so I would loop in somebody at the district office related to special education, to give them a heads up of where you're at. That's helpful context if I was on the receiving end of that, for sure.
Okay, great.
But
That's so
I'm
helpful.
not
Yeah,
saying I'm not saying the other person is giving you inaccurate information, but it might not be that same proactive like reception because that's not their department, if that makes sense. They're more kind of on the enrollment homeschool side of things.
yes, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I appreciate that. Yeah, I
Of
just
course.
I'm trying to prepare as much beforehand because I'm trying to make the transition as smooth as possible. And I
Mhm.
wasn't sure like what kind of documentation is required to present that I can already have on hand. And so we can get them in school, as soon as possible. Yeah.
Yeah, that 2-year-old assessment data is what you have right now. That's what I would have as your piece of evidence. Yeah, good question though.
Great. Sorry for taking up so much of the
No,
airtime,
not
but
at
I
all.
appreciate
That's why
that.
we're
This is
here.
exactly what I needed to know.
Yeah, that's why we're here.
All right. Anyone else have any questions?